Chris, I'm the day-to-day apologist. Have you ever heard this question before? Isn't the Bible just made up of a bunch of fairy tales? Now, that's an intriguing question. One in which the answer doesn't just take 5 seconds. But when a person asks this question, we have to be willing to ask a question in return. When you say the Bible, are you talking Old Testament? Are you talking New Testament? Can you give me an example on which area you're talking about? Now, a lot of people will say, well, I have a hard time believing that Jonah being swallowed by a whale and being burped out after 3 days is believable. Or a man who resurrected someone from the dead and died themselves and 3 days resurrected. I have a hard time believing in that. I have a hard time believing a man who took a staff and stuck it in water and split a sea. Or a fire cloud at night and a cloud of air by day that these people, thousands of people, followed through a desert. I mean, it all just sounds like fairy tales. Well, let's focus on the Old Testament first. Now, a lot of people who ask this question possibly could have never have read a Bible or only have heard stories from their childhood years. We need to understand that the Bible as a whole is comprised of a lot of things. Old Testament-wise, it's comprised of history, genealogies, poetry, worship songs, law, and prophecy. It's 39 books, not just one book, written by somewhere around 28, 30 authors. Some people like to debate on the unknowns, that they don't know who wrote specific books, but for the most part, we know that it's in a ballpark around there. We know that ballpark as well that the Bible is written somewhere around 1400 BC or 1300 BC, and we know pretty certain that the Old Testament ended in 430 BC with the book of Malachi. Now, when we are focusing on the Old Testament, as I mentioned before, the first thing that we need to focus on is the accuracy of writing. I mean, it is a fairy tale if the writing of the original manuscripts are not the same of what's being written today, right? Makes sense to me. So let's talk about these guys. These guys who copied the original writings, aka the manuscripts, onto other forms. They were called scribes. Scribes were not just average people like you and I. They were highly educated and very, very good at knowing the Word, or at least the Old Testament. Most Hebrewic schools every boy would go to would have to memorize the first 5 books of the Bible, aka the Pentateuch. And when they did that, if they were to do that, they would be discipled by a rabbi or a Pharisee, Sadducee, or someone like that. And then if they wanted to, they could go into scribe writing. Now, scribes had an understanding that, like with every male in Jewish times, in the time, especially in the Old Testament, their trade was a representation of who they are. So they took their trade very seriously, considering it was also their only means of income and provision for their family. So when the scribes would start copying things, here is actually the things that were required or that were checked upon to make sure that they were accurate. Did you know that they developed a numerical system to ensure an accurate copy of the manuscript to the other form in which they were copying the Old Testament? Or that they counted the number of lines, letters, and words per page of the new copy, and then checked them with the count of the original. If they didn't match up, they would have to pitch out the entire copy, and the scribe would have to start all over. Now, I'm going to be reading off of a list of other rules, because there's 10 of them that I found. And I just want you to listen to the rules and regulations that the scribes had on themselves, or that other scribes would hold to other scribes while they were copying the Old Testament. They could only use clean animal skins both to write on and even bind manuscripts. Interesting. Each column of writing could have no less than 48 and no more than 60 lines. The ink must be black and have a special recipe. Weird, right? They must verbalize each word aloud as they were writing. Now, for those of you that sit behind a desk and have to type all day, how would you like to verbalize everything out loud? And keep in mind, they probably were not alone while they were doing this. There were other scribes probably with them, or someone who was going to check on their stuff. They must wipe the pen and wash their entire bodies every time they wrote the word Jehovah on it, Why? Because the scribes believed that there was a real God who was outside of time, space, and matter, but who was going to judge them and hold them accountable for taking the word that he spoke through people as they penned it down. So they believed that their God was going to hold them accountable. So they took this stuff seriously. They took the name of God seriously. Now, another thing was that they had to have their review within 30 days. And if as many as 3 pages required corrections, the entire manuscript had to be redone. That stinks. The letters, words, and paragraphs had to be counted, the documents, as I mentioned before. But here's the kicker. They would become invalid if 2 letters touched each other. The middle paragraph, word, and letter must correspond to those of the original document. The documents can only be stored in sacred places like synagogues, so that prevented people from getting their hands on this stuff and trying to edit and change things. As no document containing God's word could be destroyed, they were either stored, buried in a place called the Genaza, and it was a Hebrew term meaning hiding place. And they were usually kept, as I mentioned, in synagogues or in Jewish cemeteries. So one of the no-nos of Levitical law was messing around with dead bodies and things like that and going to like Jewish cemeteries. So these scribes would put these manuscripts in places that they knew law-wise people weren't going to be going to make themselves unclean, because again, on Levitical law, they lived by it. So I thought that was very interesting. So as you just heard, there was a lot of expectations for the scribes copying things down. And as I already mentioned, they felt that God himself was going to hold them accountable. He was going to hold the scribes who were checking on the scribes who were writing the manuscript to the manuscript. Now, as I did mention, we do not have the original manuscripts of the Bible. But most things that have been written down throughout history don't have original manuscripts. It's just when the writers were writing, they were not thinking, oh, this needs to last like 5,000 years. So can we then, with that information, trust that what is being said is accurate? I believe yes. I believe we can look back pretty far into history and see manuscripts that were written. Well, how could you be certain of that? The answer to that is the Dead Sea Scrolls. But we'll be covering that in my next video, in my historical evidence video. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure you hit the subscribe button. I know it was a little longer than usual, but this question is a serious question and it demands good responses. I hope you enjoyed this. Share this with people and also hit the notification button. I post videos every Tuesday and Thursday. God bless, and I hope it helped. See you next time.